Hey everyone, before we get started with the words you're wondering about, I just want to remind you of the process we use when we're looking at words and hypothesizing word sums. So the first thing we ask ourselves is, how do you think the word is built? What are the morphemes or the parts that we recognize from other words that we can start to isolate and figure out what the base of the word might be? Then we have to ask ourselves, what other words share those parts? So if we've ended up with a part that we can't explain or connect to other words in English spelling, we probably have made some kind of error, because there's very few words that are the only one with that particular morpheme. Once we've done that, we might need to revise our hypothesis. And then my favorite part is when we get to investigate and share our discoveries with one another. So my understanding is that you're looking at the words protagonist and antagonist, which means you're probably in an English class or a language arts class, and you're talking about some kind of a text. Because when we're talking about these words, we typically are using them in reference to characters that we're coming across. Now, lots of times we simplify these two words by defining them as protagonist is the main character and antagonist is the villain or the bad guy. There is a more nuanced definition where the protagonist is the character that has a particular goal that they're working towards in the story. And the antagonist is the person or thing that is preventing them from achieving that goal. So as you get older and you start reading more complicated stories or texts, the definitions of these words shift just a little bit. But you're wondering what exactly is going on when we're talking about the spelling of these two words. So let's first look at protagonist. One of the hypotheses that you might have come up with or pulled out is PROTO plus AGONIST is rewritten as PROTAGONIST, protagonist. So you've identified that this proto piece, PROTO, is at the front. And you've probably recognized that the O has been dropped. And so we end up with PROT. So we clip that particular prefix when it bumps up against a vowel letter in the next morpheme or in the base. So that might be a hypothesis that you have already come up with. The tricky part to this is I recognize still in the AGONIST a morpheme that I'm familiar with. So a more accurate representation or word sum might be PROTO plus AGON plus IST is rewritten as PROT, replace the O, AGONIST, protagonist. From here, we have to ask ourselves, can we think of other words that share these word pieces or these morphemes that we've identified? So let's think about PROTO. Can we think of any other words that have this meaning or sense of first with this word part? And I could think of the words prototype and even protocol, where I see PROTO, or the clipped version, as you might have brainstormed other words, meaning first. So I think I'm onto something there. Next, I'm going to ask myself the same thing for the IST. So what does an IST do as a morpheme? Well, it represents, or it's a word making element that means one who does or makes. It can also reference someone who has certain beliefs or adheres to certain doctrines or streams of thought. But for simplicity's sake, we're going to think of it as one who does, okay? So can I think of other words where IST is being used in this sense? And I can. I think of the word pianist, someone who plays the piano. Chemist, someone who works with chemicals or chemistry. Activist, someone who is protesting or actively working to make changes. So I've got some parts here that I'm pretty confident about, and that leaves me with agon as a base or a base element. Now, I'm not super familiar with this base or base element, so I want to put a pin in this word right now and move on to the next word that you also want to dig in and see if we land in a similar spot. So the next word is antagonist. And what you might have come up with when you look at the word antagonist is anti, knowing that we're going to drop that I or clip that prefix when it is butting up against a vowel. So anti plus agonist is rewritten as ant, replace the I, agonist, antagonist. Okay. Now we've landed in a similar spot as we did with the previous word. I can see inside of that remaining element an ist, which I know is another morpheme or a word building part, often called a suffix because it comes after the base element. anti plus agon plus ist is rewritten as ant, replace the I, agonist, antagonist. Repeating the process that we did with the previous word. Can I think of other words that are sharing these affixes? Well, we have anti, anti, meaning against or opposed. So can I think of some words that use this prefix with this same sense or meaning? And I came up with antacid. So when you got heartburn and your parents need to take a Tums, that's an antacid. It's something that's fighting against the acid in your stomach. Or Antarctic, it's the opposite of the Arctic. So we have the Arctic on one side of the globe and the Antarctic on the other side of the globe. And then we have things like anti-bullying. So anti is a prefix that you can see in a hyphenated form or smooshed together as a morpheme within a word. And we already know about ist because we did that with the previous word. And so once again, we're in a spot where we have agon as a base or a base element, which makes me wonder, what exactly does that even mean? So now that I've done some pre-thinking, I can go into our online etymology dictionary and do some digging and confirm, or maybe not, our hypothesis. So I'm going to go over to Etym Online and I'm going to search in protagonist because that was the first one that we looked at. So we have the entry here. When you look at an Etym Online entry, the first part that you come across is when it is first attested or found in English spelling, and it's working definition at that time. And then it goes forward to see if the meaning of the word has changed. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So we have protagonist as a noun coming to us from the 1670s, meaning principal character in a story or drama. From Greek. I don't speak Greek, so I'm not going to try to say that part. An actor who plays the chief or the first part. Makes sense. From protos, meaning first. Now, when you see this PIE, means Proto-Indo-European, we skip that part because that part is hypothesized. We don't have evidence of it written down, so we skip it. Then we go to, again, I don't speak Greek, agonistes, meaning actor or competitor. From agon, meaning contest. Okay, so we can see here this agon directly from Greek. So this is a Greek origin word that we're dealing with. And it just so happens that the Greek root, agon, is the base element that we're talking about here in this word. It doesn't always work out that the root or where it comes from is the same. So you're going to see here that Doug Harper, who is the person who's built this website, has linked two different words. we're going to get to agony in just a second, but I want to go here to where it says the general meaning of The Leading Person in a Cause or Contest is from 1889. And at some point in some writings, you might have seen this word being used for advocate or supporter, which is a misunderstanding of the Greek word or the word parts that they saw in it. But it's saying here, compare to antagonist. Well, weirdly enough, that's our other word we want to look at. So let's look up antagonist. Now, the word antagonist, one who contends with another, is from the 1590s. So originally, the word antagonist was not related to characters in a play, performers, or any of those things. The word antagonist was talking about rivals or opponents or competitors. In fact, it wasn't until 1914 that the word antagonist was used to talk about characters in a text. So, antagonist used in this way is relatively new in the world of English spelling, which is why when we look at the meaning or senses of each of the parts of antagonist, it's harder for us to make that connection to plays or performances or stories, because originally that was not its intent. It was talking about opponents or rivals in a contest. Okay. So when we keep that in mind and we click over to agony, we can see how, if we skip down to this second paragraph, we have agon, meaning an assembly or mass of people brought together to watch games, specifically a contest. And then it evolved to mean a struggle or trial. So when we're talking about this collection of words, they have a connection to this agon Greek base, meaning struggle or contest. But originally, antagonist was not used in reference to characterization, which is why it's a little harder to connect some of those dots. If I go back to protagonist, I can see here that this is being used since the 1670s. So it was almost a little under 300 years later that we used the opposite. Now we see that as the opposite, antagonist. But for 300 years, that word was not used in that way. So when we get into this situation, that's where it can be a little bit confusing for us who are learning how to look at words and word sums to see how the parts all fit together. But we know they fit together because Doug has laid out the story here for us to say, you know what? The word protagonist and the word antagonist are connected to the word agony. And because of the connections that Doug has laid out for us, we can build a word matrix that represents the connection between all of these words. So agon is the base. Then we see words like protagonist and antagonist, but also agony and agonize. So this allows us to see the connection between the two words that you originally were wondering about, protagonist and antagonist, but it also allows us to dig a little deeper and realize that the word agony is part of this word family. I hope this proved to be helpful. Good luck with all your word study.